Daniel Ellsberg, leading activist in the nuclear freeze movement, author of the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War. How do the goals of American liberals today differ from those who fought to end the conflict in Vietnam?
Is that a title of tonight's talk, or are you asking me?
That is one of the questions that we'll be talking about tonight.
I think that what people are learning today about Watergate, day by day as it leaks out, corresponds very much to what the Pentagon Papers had to reveal 15 years ago about our government policy making. In those days, it took documents to convince an American citizen that his president might be lying to him. If that's not true today, it's because the Pentagon Papers did come out and they saw an awful lot of documents that were very painful reading at the time, that men we'd voted for, worked for, campaigned for, I'd worked for several presidents, had been all carrying out a policy that was entirely different from what they'd told us, different aims, different expectations, in some cases violating laws, violating our Constitution, doing it secretly, a covert foreign policy that was out of control of the public. I think that's what we're hearing about today, and that's why we're about to have hearings on that subject. I expect to learn a lot from those hearings. I just got cable and C-SPAN television for the first time in my life in expectation of those hearings. I want to follow them.
I hope you enjoy them. Would you explain for our viewers who may have forgotten or may be too young to remember your role in the Pentagon Papers?
Well, you described me as the author of the Pentagon Papers. That's a little misleading. I did draft one of the volumes of the Pentagon Papers. There were 43 main volumes plus some negotiations volumes, all top secret, dealing with the history, this was the title, History of U.S. Decision-Making in Vietnam from 1945 to 1968. The project started in 1968, and like most Americans, the people doing the study in the Pentagon, of which I was one, thought the war was about to end at that point. President Johnson had just said that he would not run again. He was asking for negotiations, and people thought that it was about over. Actually, it had 7 years to go. I was working on a project then, the Pentagon, so-called Pentagon Papers, which was to learn lessons from the Pentagon, from the Vietnam War. And when that study was completed by '69, I was at the Rand Corporation on contract to the Defense Department. I was the only researcher in the country authorized to have the entire study in my possession to do a project on lessons from Vietnam. And as I read those volumes, I thought increasingly, as I saw the war going on, that these were lessons that shouldn't be just mine to learn and shouldn't be just the Pentagon's to learn, that the American public needed to know this information about how they'd been lied to and how they'd been manipulated into that war. So in 1969, I began copying those top secret volumes that were in my safe. I had authorized possession to them, and giving them what I was not authorized to do, giving them to Senator Fulbright, then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he expected to hold hearings, but ultimately did not hold hearings on the basis of those documents. And eventually, 2 invasions later, Laos and Cambodia, many American deaths, many Vietnamese deaths later, I gave the documents to the New York Times, and when they were enjoined, for the first time in our history from publishing, I gave copies to the Washington Post and to 17 newspapers in all, for which I was put on trial, facing 115 years in prison.
You, of course, never went to trial. Perhaps you can
I went to trial.
You went to trial.
I was 5.5 months in court, but about the time that we were due to go to summation and go to the jury, after 5.5 months in court, after nearly 2 years in the court proceedings, a series of revelations came out of the so-called plumbers, revealing that the White House had illegally done operations. The analogy to today is not coincidental, it's almost a replay, that a set of people in the White House had been doing burglaries, had gone into my former psychoanalyst's office and trying to get material to blackmail me into silence. There had been an attempt to incapacitate me or murder me doing a speech in Washington. Phones had been tapped, 17 newsmen had been tapped, and many, including members of the NSC staff. I'd been overheard on those, and the records had been concealed so as to keep them out of my trial. And after 10 days of continuous revelations of this, CIA and so forth, all charges were dismissed against me by the judge on grounds of gross governmental misconduct. I believe, by the way, that we are in for revelations of a very similar nature in the coming months.
What makes you believe that?
It's very clear that everything we've heard, everything that Mr. Meese has so far officially disclosed about Colonel North's operations indicate covert operations run in violation of laws of Congress, and in this case, not, it would seem, against an American citizen, but against the law and against the citizens of another country, of Nicaragua. There seems very clear, as many people have already concluded in the Senate and the House, which is why they set up the committees, that major laws have been broken by the executive branch and by the White House. The role of the President is not yet clear, but the role of people working directly for him is clear. We have a spectacle of an executive branch out of democratic control, an executive branch that has not submitted to the legislative authority of Congress in the area where Congress has constitutional authority, control of the budget.
We are talking with Daniel Ellsberg, who has just described his role in the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War. He is currently an activist in the nuclear freeze movement. I'll give a little of his lengthy background. He was a strategic analyst for the RAND Corporation for a number of years, different periods. In 1964, he joined the Defense Department as the Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs. Went to Vietnam as a State Department official in 1965 and 66. While at RAND, the RAND Corporation in 1961 developed the first Kennedy administration guidelines for general nuclear war plans. He has been active with the Nuclear Freeze Strategy Task Force and the American Peace Test, which is demonstrated in Washington and at the Nevada testing site. Since the early 70s, you've lectured and taught college seminars. You were in the U.S. Marine Corps from 1954 to 1957, I believe. Do you find in the nuclear freeze movement many of the same liberals who led the fight to end the war in Vietnam?
Well, many, yes, but the movements do differ quite a bit. The freeze movement is not a campus-based movement, particularly, and of course it doesn't have the veteran phenomenon either. When it's, in terms of people who support, who want to see a bilateral, that is a mutual, two-sided ending to the arms race by the Soviet Union and by the U.S., an ending to testing, deployment, and production of nuclear weapons, that's 80% of the public. That's the public. I mean, it's not the Vietnam War movement, it's not any movement, that's the public to a first approximation, except for the people in the White House and the Pentagon and 20% minority. In terms of, however, the people who have been quite active, you get a much older generation doing of all kinds of activities in this movement than I think you got in Vietnam, which was much more of a youthful protest movement on the whole. It's much more broadly based. All groups in society, I think, are represented in it. It's about, I'm here in Washington this weekend to attend a meeting of the SANE Board of Directors. That's Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, and I was just elected to the board. That's a 30-year-old organization. It's been working against nuclear testing all that time. They voted this weekend, while I was here, to merge with the Freeze, the National Freeze Campaign, which in terms of actually activists, 1,700 chapters, is the largest grassroots movement probably this country has seen of any kind. And the two groups, the Freeze Campaign and SANE, merged just now. I think it'll be a quite unprecedented lobby, citizens' lobby and grassroots movement, focusing right now on ending at last, after that 30 years campaign, ending the testing of nuclear weapons. We want to see the U.S. join the Soviet moratorium on nuclear testing, the Soviet cessation of testing, preferably right now, before the Soviets test again.
We will be going to the telephones in just a minute or two. Please call us if you have a question or a comment on any of the subjects we have already raised or any others that you're interested in. The numbers, which you will see at the base of your screen, are if you're calling from the Eastern or Central time zones, area 202-628-2525. If you're calling from the Pacific or Mountain time zones, area 202-783-2727. Do you find in the liberal opposition to aid to the Contras or to getting involved in the war in Nicaragua, some of the leaders of the old liberal movement in Vietnam?
Well, again, when you say leaders of that movement, they've moved on, most of them, to other things. Habby Hoffman has not, I noticed. He's just facing trial and has been to Nicaragua a number of times. I came into that movement, indeed, after '68 and after Chicago protests. I came from the Rand Corporation and from the Defense Department, from a different background to most of people in that movement. In a way, my entry was like that of the veterans in Vietnam who'd had that experience and came into it. But the point is, I think that the movement against our intervention in Nicaragua represents people, young and old, who did learn a very different lesson from that war than President Reagan learned. They learned that they don't want to reproduce it in Nicaragua or anywhere else, that it was hard to give one word to it, a mistake, a tragic error. I came to see it as criminal in many ways, in the sense that it broke laws of our own country, our Constitution, and international law in many ways. But even people who did not, and I based that on documents that I'd seen, my experiences in Vietnam, and that wasn't a judgment that was shared by everybody who opposed that war. But it was enough to see that it was a war that must end. And it did end because of our founders, of our Constitution, their wisdom in providing ways for the Congress to leash in, to rein in an executive out of control. It was one of the major reasons for separating from England and all, to get out from the tyranny of autocratic executive control. And the provision for Congress to cut off the money enabled Congress to end that war on public demand by cutting off the funding for the bombing. That is the way I think the arms race can be ended. I think it's really the only way it can be ended. Congress must take that responsibility for suspending money, as the House did before Iceland, in a strong majority vote, cut off the funding for the testing of nuclear weapons, so long as the Soviets were not testing. No Soviet testing, no US testing. That was, say, a strong majority vote. And now with the Democratic Senate, I think that there's a real prospect that the Congress as a whole will do that. If they do, they'll be doing something that has really one precedent. That was the way the Vietnam War was ended. And that's a precedent of power and of success.
We'll take our first telephone call from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, Mr. Ellsberg. How are you doing?
How are you? Where should I look?
Into the camera.
As a survivor of the USS Liberty attack that was back in 1967, I'm sure you remember it well.
Pardon me, you are a survivor?
Yes, I am, sir.
Hey.
The crew of the Liberty feels it was a deliberate attack, and we've been trying for the last 20 years to come out with this and have a government come forward and tell us, you know, their full story. I'm sure you could shed some light on this. Do you feel that the government will ever come out with the true story to satisfy us, and would you, with your knowledge of the government at that time, be willing to help us with our plight?
I certainly would I have studied that, not in detail, and I didn't know of it officially, the details at the time. What I've studied, as I'm sure you're aware, is that there is very strong evidence, the circumstances of the attack, the prolongation of it, the targeting, suggest very strongly that it was a deliberate Israeli attack, probably intended to keep the U.S. from knowing the Israeli counterattack plans at that point, the fact that they planned to launch an offensive at that moment, and they deliberately chose to hit an ally's ship in the fear that the president, if he knew that, if he had that intelligence indication, might act on it to restrain them. By the way, to bring that up to date, that's a very, obviously there are the strong bases for our close relationship with Israel, and at the same time, there couldn't be a more spectacular demonstration, if you like, that our ally, any allies, interests may at a given moment sharply diverge from those of the U.S. The fact that our ally Israel could actually deliberately and without admitting it covertly attack an American ship and cause casualties is the strongest illustration of that. Obviously, we're seeing that in the current situation, and I think that the example that you bring up is one the American people should reflect on to in part understand how it came to be that having chosen an ally, the Israelis in this case, to be our agents in dealing with Iran, we put ourselves in a position where we were subject to some manipulation and to actions that were not really in our interest.
C-SPAN will be carrying this Friday at 6 p.m. a call-in program with David Horowitz and Peter Collier, former editors of Ramparts magazine. The topic will be Perspectives on the Vietnam War, their article in Commentary magazine, Another Low, Dishonest Decade on the Left. They will be taking a view somewhat contrary to that expressed by our guest tonight, and we hope you will be here for that program. We'll take another call now, this one from Burbank, California. Go ahead, please.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Good evening. We hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Mr. Ellsberg, I'd just like to say God bless you for helping get us out of Vietnam. I mean, because I was going to be next. And, I would, and I supported the Contras, too. I thought, well, not because I like them, not because of the corporate country involved, but, and I thought by doing that maybe our government might have learned the right lesson. But it doesn't seem like that's what's happened. I don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, in between, or you don't know what's going on. If you're going to support the Contras, then it takes the American people support, and I think that's something that our government officials have forgotten. And we're kind of lucky to have a Daniel Ortega, because if we do support the Contras, then all of a sudden our public officials are asked the question, what do we stand for? And it's something they want to, something they haven't addressed yet. Anyhow, I thought I got a cute little song. It's only 4 verses, and it's for the members of Congress, and I know you'll love it. I know you'll love it. So, and it's not something you have to respond to, but I think you are worthy of hearing it. And if you can bear with me, it's just 4 verses, and it goes like this. It goes, Congress was deadlocked. This must not go on. I voted aid to the Contras. I've got to be strong against communism. I voted aid to the Contras. Now I will win my next re-election. I voted aid to the Contras. Aid to the region will trick everyone. I voted aid to the Contras. Doesn't Nicaragua, when the United States and the Soviet Union, doesn't that look like a Chernobyl waiting to happen? And I'll hang up and I'll let you respond, and God bless you.
Well, thank you. You give me various things to respond to there. I must say I'm forced to reflect on the fact that I was a Contra in Vietnam. I was an American Contra in the sense in which President Reagan proclaims himself a Contra now. It's counter-revolutionary against the Revolutionary National Movement. I was trying to win that war for America, and for the people, the Vietnamese who were on our side, who could well have been called Contras at that point. A lot of them were my friends. I certainly can have sympathy in that sense for the people who are, I think many of them, very sincerely, the younger people in that country who have joined the Contras just in the spirit in which people worked on the American side in Vietnam. And yet sympathy and a kind of pity for people who find themselves working essentially for foreigners in a cause which cannot and does not have the support of most of their country people, men and women. It's a hopeless situation for them to be in, and it's not a situation for us to be in, hiring people to do that, to fight against their own countrymen. I can also recognize, I think, from what I've heard, the Contra leaders, from the information we have, and I think what we're going to be getting in terms of the leaders, the Contra leaders we backed in Vietnam. Those Vietnamese, too, were drug runners, murderers, terrorists. Not all of them. As I say, some of them were close friends of mine, people that I respected, and others were people that the United States should not have had as agents and should not have called allies, and that seems very clearly to be true of a number of the Contra leaders who we inherited from the regime of Somoza. I was in Vietnam because I thought that the presence of Americans could be good for that country, for those people. There were a lot of bombers along with me, and napalm and troops who were getting shot at and shooting. And our presence wasn't good for that country or this country, and I think that would be true in Nicaragua.
Birmingham, Alabama, do you have a question or a comment?
Good evening.
Good evening.
Mr. Ellsberg, I was at the Chicago Nuclear Freeze Convention last month and went to a couple of your workshops, and you were absolutely wonderful. I want you to know that.
And the audience here.
Well,
Thank you.
being from Alabama, I want to ask you, what is your opinion of how we can best influence conservative congressmen, conservative senators to vote for ending the arms race? Our congressmen here in Alabama, our senators, for the most part, they've always voted for the MX. They've always voted for Star Wars. How can we influence conservative Southern politicians to vote to end the arms race?
Well, the reason I've been talking about Congress somewhat more than the executive here tonight is because Congress, as shown in the Vietnam War and other cases, is more responsive to the people. They're closer to them. They have smaller constituencies. They hear more from their constituents than that single or two elected men at the head of the executive branch. Far more responsive, and in large part because they face re-election every 2 years in the House, or 6 years otherwise. There's an old expression in Washington about Congress: if they don't see the light, they may yet feel the heat. And you speak how you can influence your conservative congressmen or senators, House. And the answer ultimately is, certainly you should reason with them and let them know what you feel and what it takes to represent your attitudes and those of your colleagues and those who agree with you. And you should also let them know that they work for you, that they are your servants. That's the glory of this country. That's what we do fight for in our wars to defend, and it's worth fighting for. Our wars do not always serve that cause of democracy very well, but it's what the people fighting the war at the fighting level believe themselves to be fighting for, and they're not wrong to think that it's worth it. So you should let them know that they will be fired if they don't carry out the will of their constituents. Not just yours, of course, but you should work to make that a majority, help make it a majority opinion. And that can be done. Very specifically, you can let them know that what you want of them as your representatives and public servants is to use their constitutional power in the Senate as well as the House to do what the House did last fall, and that is to vote to suspend to cut off all testing for nuclear weapons so long as the Soviets do not test. That could end testing forever, whatever President Reagan or his successors feels about it. That would be the public will. The great majority of the American people do want that to happen, just as they want an overall freeze. And the administration has been ignoring that as they have been ignoring a number of other things. It's time now for them to feel the heat from Congress.
How does the nuclear freeze movement go about lobbying Congress, aside from the demonstrations you stage from time to time here in Washington?
The freeze movement on the whole was, well, they had very large demonstrations, letter writing, lobbying of the usual sort, which means having informed representatives in Washington, going to the offices of the congressmen, letting them know what bills we support, and helping them draft legislation in some cases. In a number of cases, the freeze encouraged people to come on their own to Washington for major days of lobbying. It's only quite late in the game that the freeze movement, which wanted to distinguish itself from the protest movements of the 60s, to tell the truth, and therefore stood aloof from the tactic of civil disobedience, for example. Only really quite recently did it come to endorse actions of the kind that are going to happen at the Nevada CES site tomorrow, as a matter of fact, tomorrow morning, the 27th, where Martin Sheen is probably going to be arrested with Chris Christopherson, protesting nuclear testing on the anniversary of the first nuclear test there.
That demonstration will include acts of civil disobedience.
There'll be both demonstrations. I think there'll be a presence here at the DOE. On February 5th, we expect really quite a major protest blockade. As I say, this is not a freeze action. This is an action, however, which the Freeze and SANE have endorsed. There will be an action of blockade of that test site, trying to delay symbolically with our bodies the first American nuclear test of 1987, because that test, according to the Soviets, will end their moratorium. They will feel free to resume testing after 18 months of no tests, which means that that test will restart a two-sided test program. In my opinion, for the President to start the Soviets testing again by continuing our testing on February 5th would be an act as unwise, desperately unwise, as his first shipment of arms to Iran. We need to help him by resisting that policy.
San Diego, California. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Ellsberg, I think of you as one of democracy's martyrs, in a sense, and that I imagine that you must have paid a pretty big price, both professionally, legally, personally, economically, for what you did. Is that, one, true? Two, do you have any regrets? And it sounds like from the integrity in your voice that you don't. And three, would there be any advice that you'd have to potential whistleblowers, either in government and corporate service today, who may have to make moral choices that really could affect their professional or economic future? Thank you.
Well, thank you for what you said. Actually, I don't think of myself as a martyr, and it wouldn't be appropriate for anyone to think of me that way. The White House in those days had intended that I be a martyr of some kind, but they failed. They were the ones who went to jail on the whole. President Nixon himself was impeached, in part because he thought about me, he had me more on his mind than was good for him. But in fact, they failed to make me a martyr at all. So my wife was with me throughout that ordeal of the trial, and that is an ordeal, and we go closer than ever, and that's the core of my life. I have a new young son and a lot of friends. I do have to say that my friends are mostly new friends, because everyone I'd known had a clearance, really, in the 15 years that I worked for the executive branch. I was a kind of leper after that trial. Being with me at all, I think, I've learned indirectly from some of them, led them to feel that it would jeopardize their careers. Of course, many disagreed with what I'd done very intensely. Others who didn't still felt that they couldn't afford to associate with me. So I lost essentially all of my friends, with a very few exceptions. Obviously, that was a big price. But there is life outside the executive branch. There are a lot of friends available who don't have clearances, and the new friends I've made are very valuable to me.
For those of you who may have forgotten how big the Pentagon Papers case and Daniel Ellsberg's role in it was back in the 1970s, I would refer you to the book by Woodward and Bernstein, All the President's Men, and let me read a line from that book. The disclosure that Hunt and Liddy, two of the convicted figures in Watergate, had supervised the burglary of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office had inextricably linked Watergate and the Ellsberg trial in Los Angeles. In the Post newsroom, the two stories were often referred to as Watergate East and Watergate West. Does that reference bring back memories?
Well, I remember the day when it was revealed in the court that the White House plumbers, Hunt and Liddy, who did correspond in function and sort of role to Colonel North and some of the other, had burgled the psychoanalyst's office. Watergate had been big news on the East Coast for a while, and the reporters covering my trial certainly felt that they were in a backwater. They said, you know, my God, Watergate meets the Pentagon Papers. It was exciting for them, but it was exciting for us, and of course it did lead to the end of the trial. New York City, you are on C-SPAN.
Hi, yes, I heard Mr. Ellsberg in New York City on WBAI radio, and I found it very interesting. My question is sort of related to that. There's a program they have there called Contragate between 8 and 8:30, and I listen to it pretty regularly when I wake up, and I hear all kinds of stories on this radio show about Contra drug connections, a plot to kill Ambassador Thames, the ambassador to Costa Rica that the Contras and the CIA were set up, and a host of other stories which are they make the Reagan administration seem like really traitors. And what I don't understand is why I don't hear this in the mainstream press, and I'm just wondering if most of these stories are fabrications by this radio station WBAI, or if this is really happening and the press is not reporting it.
Well, I just spent last evening talking to a very fine American, very patriotic and dedicated American named Daniel Sheehan, who is working for subsistence wages as a lawyer in a public interest law firm, a religious-based public interest law firm called the Christic Institute. And they have taken on the defense of two Americans named Tony Avirgan and Martha Honey, and named as defendants in this suit 29 officials, I'm sorry, a slight slip, but not entirely, 29 individuals, many of them former officials or the United States government, that they charge as having been conspirators in a long criminal conspiracy violating laws of this country, which in part had the effect of severely injuring Tony Avirgan when he was covering a press conference of Eden Pastora, the Contra leader in Costa Rica. And the charge, with a good deal of, I was reading now a lot of the evidence that they have in the affidavit that supports that suit, is that these people, some of whom were then American officials at the time, were involved in trying to kill Eden Pastora because he wouldn't cooperate with the CIA. The suit also involves these same individuals in plotting to kill, with witnesses and participants, Louis Tams, that you mentioned, the ambassador of Costa Rica, who was, by the way, a great Contra supporter, and for that very reason was a candidate for assassination by these Contras, because his assassination was to be blamed, according to the suit, which is a sworn affidavit, on the Sandinistas and be used as a provocation or an excuse for an American attack on Nicaragua, something like the Tonkin Gulf provocations that were involved that led to our attacks in North Vietnam. I've read a good deal, I say, of the evidence supporting this. Some of this is about to come out. If these allegations are true, and I can vouch that it's my judgment that Danny Sheehan of the Christic Institute deserves great support. I'm very impressed by him. And if these allegations are true and are proven in court, we will see that our government has engaged in what can only be described as a criminal conspiracy, whether or not it was authorized by the President of the United States. We don't hire a president, we don't elect a president to break the laws of the United States, to murder or injure American citizens and otherwise break laws such as the Neutrality Act or the Boland Amendment forbidding money going down to Nicaragua. His oath that we demand of him in the Constitution is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So whether or not the President was aware, the allegations make a pattern of what the suit calls racketeering, and that's not the business our government should be in.
I want to inject at this time into this discussion an article that I know you disagree with, the article we referred to earlier, that will be the subject of a C-SPAN call-in program on Friday at 6 o'clock. It is called Another Low, Dishonest Decade on the Left. The authors are Peter Collier and David Horowitz. David Horowitz being, I believe, a former close friend of yours. Is that true? Yeah. And they are quite critical of the New Left. And one of their criticisms is the post-Vietnam left is always ready to believe the official Soviet lie, give the Soviets the benefit of the doubt, or where the abuses are too great, at least to understand, in quotes, horrific Soviet acts as a legitimate reflexive fear of American power. Your response?
Well, I think that's slanderously wrong. I'm very dismayed to hear my former friend, who's a brilliant analyst of the Cold War and a strong leader in the fight against Vietnam, say such a thing. He has certain elements of the left, known personally to him very intimately, of whom that could probably be said to be true, a very tiny minority of the American public and of the anti-war movement. But as a description of the majority of the movement, and specifically of the movement to end nuclear arms race, that couldn't be less true. The Freeze movement, of which I'm part, was an original sponsor, put great emphasis on stopping Soviet testing, deployment, production of weapons, because we regard the Soviet weapons as enormously threatening to the world security, having the capability, obviously, like ours, of ending life on Earth. And it seems to us extremely important that there should be no new Soviet weapons, no more Soviet weapons, indeed that there should be enormously less. We don't know any way of achieving that lets the United States continue to proliferate weapons, not that we would like that to happen anyway. It's obvious that that can only be done by a mutual freeze. But the people who most claim that the anti-nuclear movement is pro-Soviet, slanderously, and I must very regretfully include the President in that. His statements to that effect have to be described, in my opinion, as slanderous. Whether he knows better, I don't know. David Horowitz certainly does know better. But those people, led by the President, seem to have no concern at all how many new weapons the Soviets have. The Soviets have, in effect, passed the switch to their own testing to President Reagan. They've said, if you don't test in 1987, there will be no Soviet tests, just as there were none in 1986. As I said before, for him to press that button by testing an American weapon is deeply foolish. To do it in the name of anti-communism is bizarre. What it means is that the President thinks it doesn't matter how many tests the Soviets make, how many new weapons they make, as long as we test more, as we have, as long as we have more weapons. I think that's deeply foolish, and that as foolish as some of the other policies we're learning about now, and it's up to us as American citizens to change those policies.
How about the Reagan administration argument that we have to resume testing because we have fallen behind the Soviets in the development of a new generation of nuclear weapons?
Well, it's false. We've conducted some 24 tests while they haven't tested any in the last 18 months, and even so, as DOD, Department of Defense, and Department of Energy spokesmen have made clear, people at Livermore Laboratory, for example, have made clear, we're ahead in virtually every qualitative aspect of the arms race, certainly in such things as the X-ray laser. I will say the Reagan administration did make the claim that the Soviets could have an X-ray laser, a bomb-pumped X-ray laser, a major part of the President's Star Wars program, without further testing. That was so false that Livermore Laboratory, not what David Horowitz would include in the left wing, particularly, Livermore Laboratory made statements saying, no, that was not true in the DOE. They certainly could not have such a weapon without more testing. I'll say, by the way, I don't want the Soviets to have an X-ray laser. The only way to stop them is for us to forego our having such a weapon, and that's a very good bargain for us.
Eugene, Oregon, sorry to keep you waiting. Go ahead, please.
Okay, hi, C-SPAN. I'd like to thank Mr. Ellsberg for having the courage to turn over the Pentagon Papers to the American people. I'm a Vietnam veteran, and I currently own a small business up here in the Northwest. And I'd like to comment on the Contra situation that is developing. Now, I have to take exception when C-SPAN mentions that you referred to the people being liberals that are against the Contras, but the latest poll that I heard said that 68% of the American people don't agree with President Reagan's policy in Central America, and certainly all of them can't be liberals. Now, it seems to me that if the Reagan administration wants to modify the Sandinista regime to more along the lines of their way of thinking, they could have accomplished this to a much greater extent through economic help, instead of spending $1 billion on the Contras and trying to starve the Nicaraguan economy. If the Reagan administration had economically tried to help the Nicaraguan government, that they could have gotten a lot more for their dollar. And I was wondering what Mr. Ellsberg, what he feels about the administration's chances of getting another $100 million for the Contras. I mean, it seems like we're getting close to having spent about $500 million or so on that group of people, and I believe that there would be a lot fewer Contras joining up if we weren't putting the economic squeeze on that small Central American country. And I also think that the Contra leaders and lieutenants and officers are a bunch of thugs. And I'd like your comments, please.
Well, I obviously agree with virtually everything you've said. Very specifically on the first point you raise about the who it is in the American public who opposes this. The poll I saw last week, I believe it was a Gallup poll, widely reported, showed a majority of Republicans opposing aid to the Contras. Just as, by the way, a majority of Republicans would like to see the president negotiate a bilateral nuclear freeze. In both cases, the president is ignoring the desire of a majority of his own constituency. You may or may not have noticed that it came out during the Republican convention nominating Reagan in the last election. They did a poll of the convention delegates there, and a majority of them were for the freeze. So to characterize these attitudes as the attitudes of a segment of the United States society is quite foolish, as you say. And of course I agree very much on the other lines that you said. You do not make a society more liberal by terrorizing its countryside, which is essentially what the Contras are doing. But I think I should add one thing to what you said. I think it's misleading for us to look at the policy of the United States, which is very clearly, I'm talking about President Reagan's policy, I made a slip there myself, the policy of our executive branch under President Reagan is very clearly to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, the Sandinistas. I don't believe that they think really in the Pentagon, my former colleagues there and people who are in Vietnam, that they will do that by the Contras alone. I'm sure the president is being told that the only way to do that would be by U.S.-American armed attack or invasion. I don't believe, by the way, the Joint Chiefs are recommending that, or ever have. If anything, I think they've been a moderating liberal influence, if you like, on that point. But they will follow the orders, undoubtedly, if the president should send them in, if Congress doesn't succeed in preempting it and stopping it, cutting off funds and getting that stopped. I think we, prior to Watergate, which has probably weakened the president's ability to do this politically, I think we had a very significant risk of having pictures like that come back from Nicaragua, possibly as early as this spring. And we may not have entirely eliminated that risk, because I think the president's incentive to distract us with a little war will grow very great as he faces talk, and I'm not being rhetorical here now, as he faces serious talk of impeachment and the destruction of his administration. So I think we have to be, as Thomas Jefferson said, vigilant about our leadership in the months ahead if we're to avoid the body bags and having the cover of Time and Newsweek look like that every week.
The picture like that you referred to was not on camera at the moment. I am showing it now. It is the cover of this week's Time magazine, a cover story about the movie Platoon, which some think is one of the movies that is changing the perception of the Vietnam War. I'd like to ask you if you think movies of this sort, which Time calls the best movie made about the Vietnam War in the sense of being more realistic, whether they have the power to change the American perception about that war, and to what degree that change in perception might be affecting the American attitude toward getting involved in Nicaragua.
Well, there aren't any movies of that sort, unfortunately. That's unique in my experience. That's not just the best movie made about Vietnam, the Vietnam War. It's the only movie about the Vietnam War. And so far, I hope there will be others that strive for that standard. It's an astounding movie. I would say it's the only realistic movie about war, as I saw it in Vietnam, that's ever been made. And I'm extremely happy to see the lines. When I saw it the other night, I saw the longest lines in my hometown that I'd ever seen for a movie, and I was very encouraged to see that. I would like every voting American and every American who isn't yet voting and is coming to be of draft age, a young male, to see that movie shortly. I would love Congress to see that movie as a whole. I think that would end the Contra aid that the previous listener asked about. I can't believe that they would vote money to send American boys to kill and die in such similar conditions in Nicaragua if they'd seen the realism of that movie.
Springfield, Virginia, and the snowbound Washington suburbs. Do you have a question or a comment for Daniel Ellsberg?
Yes, Mr. Ellsberg, well, I would probably fall within the 80% of people that you say would like to see the nuclear arms race stopped. I think there would be a significant number of less people as a percentage that support the way groups such as yours would want to go about it. You happen to mention, the Soviets hadn't tested, but there are a significant number of people. You may be personally concerned about not being so naive as to trust the Soviets completely, but there are a significant number of individuals that support you who call for unilateral disarmament, who believe that if we don't attack Moscow, that they'll leave us alone, and that basically support an isolationist sentiment in this country that prevailed prior to World War II, that barring an attack on Washington, that there's nowhere in the world that America should ever have to use military force. And I think that sentiment is one of the reasons you'll have a difficult time selling while many people may agree with the positions that you take, the methods that you would go about it, they won't agree with. And I don't think as a world power, would you support personally that if we gave no money to the Contras at all, and the Sandinistas invaded Honduras or anywhere else down there, that we then should attack them? Or would you say, well, then that's no threat either? Is there any place in the world other than an attack on Washington, D.C., that you feel would be justified using American force?
When I enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1954, it was with the example of the North Korean attack across the border into South Korea. I went in during the Korean emergency, although actually the fighting had essentially ended by the time I got in. And I went in feeling that I was proud of my country, that it had accepted a role as part of leading a UN police force there against the principle of aggression. I thought it wasn't presented as a unilateral action. I didn't face that particular issue of should we take on the role of the world's policeman alone. It was certainly put to us that the UN, we did have the full support of the UN in opposing that aggression. You've described a situation of hypothetical aggression by the Nicaraguans into Honduras, and if the OAS denounced that as aggression and called for combined action against that, I would think that could very well be appropriate and within American values. In other words, I'm as opposed to aggression now as I was when I was in the Marines in the 50s. Obviously, that's not what we're seeing down there. We're seeing a force that is hired, managed, controlled, equipped against the law of our country, against the wishes of Congress from 54 till 56, hired by Americans, run by Americans, going across the border to do largely murder against a civilian population, some attacks on military forces of that country in that country. That is aggression. I don't want my country ever to be the aggressor. It is right now, and it has been on other occasions. That's a policy and I'll bet you, and a lot of Americans want to see changed.
Martinez, California, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and correct me if I'm not. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Ellsberg, I'd like to ask you a question. I don't consider Russell Banks exactly a conservative, yet this gentleman is going around the United States of America. Unfortunately, he hasn't been on C-SPAN, raising monies for the Mosquito Indians, who today and every day are being murdered, tortured, and killed by the Sandinista government. That the Catholic Church in Nicaragua has their radio station, their television station, their way to communicate with the people have been shut down by the communist butchers in that country. That the Constitution, which was an excellent Constitution that they just passed, was suspended 3 days after they passed it. That there's no civil rights in that country at all. There's no free press in that country at all. And there's about 400,000 people who have decided with their legs to show you what they think of the great Sandinista government, and they're residing now in refugee camps in Costa Rica and Honduras. And I suggest to you that instead of calling it Nicaragua Gate or whatever you want to call it, why don't you call it Afghani Gate? because some of this money went to the Afghan freedom fighters who are fighting the Russian tanks with their Molotov cocktails. I haven't seen you do one thing, not one thing, to condemn the Russians about Afghanistan, where they make hand grenades like toys so kids can play with them and blow themselves up. You know, I haven't heard you say anything about the Cambodian people.
Are you asking me my opinion on
Ellsberg?
Afghanistan? I'm glad to give it to you.
1 million of their own people have been murdered by the communists there. The refugees from Vietnam that you led down the primrose path of communism, where people jump on boats with their life in danger, leaving that country in droves.
We're running a little short of time. Let's give Mr. Ellsberg a chance to respond.
I don't want Nicaragua to be our Afghanistan, as Vietnam was. As the Soviets are aggressors in Afghanistan, they're terrorists in Afghanistan. How do I know? Because I see them doing the same operations with 50 caliber machine guns. I read about it, I read the effects, I see pictures of it, that we did in Vietnam. And that was aggression, that was invasion, that was terrorism. I don't want our country to imitate the Soviet brutality in that as they're imitating ours now. In short, I don't want us to have, as I say, another Afghanistan or Vietnam in Nicaragua. The various injustices, brutalities that you speak of in Nicaragua, the other limitations of that government, which characterize a country at war and don't in many cases compare unfavorably with our own performance at war, and are extraordinarily better than the performance of our allies like El Salvador or Guatemala, which I haven't heard you mention. The fact is, put them at their worst. Put them at, you describe them, somewhat exaggerated, but they're real. You are talking about real false, real brutalities of that regime down there. Put them at their worst. Do they justify American invasion of that country? Do they justify your sons and brothers and others and your voting taxes to send down an invasion of that country? In my opinion, no. You have a right to vote your taxes that way, but you're in a minority of Americans, and I thank God for that.
We have a switchboard lit up and only about 9 minutes to go. If you'll keep your questions short, we'll see how many more we can get in. Little Rock, Arkansas. Go ahead, please.
Good evening. Mr. Ellsberg, have you read Against All Odds that came out of Cuba, prisoner for 25 years?
No, is that Valadares, the prisoner?
Yes.
I've heard that's a very good book.
Have you read the book?
No, I've heard of it. I read reviews.
I would be very grateful to you if you read the book, and then maybe you understand why it is so important that Nicaragua does not remain communist. I'd like to remind you, of course, that Vietnam today is a hell on earth, as Cambodia is, only because the United States was unable to finish its job in Vietnam. It's a fact today that the Vietnamese people on both sides are worse off, way worse off than they would have been if America had won that war.
Can we let Mr. Ellsberg respond?
Yes. One small point I think that's worth making in our understanding of the situation. The administration routinely describes Nicaragua as if it were as unfree a country as Cuba in its various aspects. That's grotesquely untrue. There are many parties allowed in Nicaragua which, in fact, I have witnessed are free to criticize and do criticize, take part in the assembly in a way that is not true in Cuba, is not true in the Eastern Bloc. There are that differences. But I don't want to press that point. It doesn't bear too much on what we're talking about today. The question is, will the liberties of the Nicaraguans and the welfare of Nicaraguans be improved if the United States reproduces in Nicaragua what we did in Vietnam and what the Soviets are now doing in Afghanistan? In my opinion, very tragically not. If you were a Cuban, it would seem to me understandable that you would individually, you would have every right, and it seemed to me very understandable to feel that there were things happening in your country that offended you terribly, that needed to be changed, that deserved even revolutionary efforts on your part. If you called in, I'm not saying that you're a Cuban, hypothetically here, if you were to call in misguidedly, as some Cubans have done, hoping that on Americans for combat help, hoping that American bombers would help free your country, you would be making the same tragic mistake that the people I worked with in Vietnam made. something would happen to that country of Cuba and Nicaragua. And if you think that hell on earth is where the Vietnamese are now, and imagine they would be better off if we were still bombing them, you are terribly misguided.
Santa Barbara, California, you are next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I have a question for Daniel Ellsberg on Lebanon. Do you think U.S. troops would be appropriate use of military force that would go in and clean out all the terrorists?
I hope that's a kind of rhetorical question, because I think the American people, getting a good look at Lebanon, correctly saw that the president had made an almost incomprehensible error in committing American Marines in small numbers or large, had he done so, to Lebanon. And it was Democratic pressure, I think, that caused them to reverse his policy and pull those Marines out after they had suffered serious terrorist casualties in there. Again, a situation where there are terrible rights and wrongs on not just both sides. One has to speak of dozens of sides in that country, and it's a kind of morass in which, for the United States to think that we could go in there and police and bring order to that situation would be the kind of arrogance of old men in power that would lead again to the deaths of innumerable young Americans lied in there by their leaders, and innumerable Lebanese. For many Lebanese right now, Lebanon is a place of hell. If American bombers were added to the individual terrorist bombers that are terrorizing that place, you would not see order, you would see a new order of hell that the Lebanese had not yet conceived of.
Freeport, Illinois, we have time for your call. If you'll keep your question short, go ahead, please.
I'd like to call your attention to an article in the Wall Street Journal of Thursday, January the 15th, that cited 137 cases from 1798 to 1970 where executive action was committed without approval of Congress. You keep throwing around the Constitution and the violation of statutes. Now, statutes are different than constitutional law. And the War Powers Act, the Boland Amendment, things like this have never been checked to their constitutionality. Would you have any comments on this?
Yes, indeed. The War Powers Act is an attempt by Congress to regain some of the powers that were clearly, specifically laid out for Congress exclusively: the power to declare war, the power to raise armies and to make war, essentially, given exclusively to, not the direction of the war, to Congress, and which powers which had been terribly eroded, not by law, not by court decisions, but by the practice of president after president, as you describe. Some of those early ones were small naval raids, rather small demonstrations. Some were not so small. President Wilson, for example, a great Democratic liberal, occupied Nicaragua for many years, as he occupied Haiti and Dominican Republic with American Marines, not the Marines' finest hour in actual fact, and not Wilson's finest hour. But that sort of thing, on a much greater scale, in the Cold War era, after Second World War, did indeed erode Congress's role to a point where people were almost willing to say, well, they're not really in it anymore, that's outmoded. Vietnam revealed to us that that constitutional power needed to be revived. The reason the president seems to have broken laws in giving aid to Nicaragua right now, to the Contras, is that there was a law to break. Congress had made a law which had no precedent before Vietnam. Vietnam had taught Congress its responsibility and its power to act constitutionally, to rein in the president, and that's why, when he ignored them, he was not just doing something unpolitical, he was acting illegally.
Our guest has been Daniel Ellsberg, an activist in the nuclear freeze movement and author of one of the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks to our C-SPAN viewers for your calls and comments. Have a pleasant evening.